So what time is it? 9:35. I think Frank gets there at 9:45. We should be good. You guys can go ahead and pass me. Hi. This is a nightly ritual. Say hi to the alley people, Gina. Anyway, so Frank Gazelle, he's the nighttime salesman down at Consumers. I've had the same salesman for 42 years. His name's Pete, but he's having a little bit of heart trouble right now. And we've all known each other for all these years, as long as I've been doing this. At one time, it was called the Produce Yards, and they've worked down there together for all these years. And I've always gone to the same wholesalers, and wherever these guys go, it's everybody goes there anyways. It's just fun. It's like family. This is the fruit auction building here. This is where it all used to be, and this used to be railroad tracks. When I first started coming down here with my father, this is where we came. And then we would do much like I'm doing now, but there would be all different vendors here in these buildings. It was Golden Triangle potato, and there was Koosman's there, Premier. Everybody had their own thing here. Like you could go into each one. There was Demasemana. Some places would just sell watermelons. Anyways, each one of these doors had a different vendor in it. And that's how it worked back in the day. It actually, as crazy as it sounds, it was much easier. And all the truck drivers, while we were waiting to get our stuff and the truck drivers were waiting for their trucks to get unloaded, then you'd go over Permanis, and that's how you got to know everybody. That's how you got to meet all the truck drivers, if they'd come in from Idaho Falls, Idaho, or wherever they came from, and you just sat and had sandwich, coffee, whatever. And that's how we all met each other. So right now, we're going down. We're gonna see what trucks are backed in, and I hope I did remember my phone. Anyways, and we're gonna place our order. Then I can pick it up in the morning, hopefully around 7:30. I like being back to the store by 8. There you are. This is Dave. I'm being filmed. Pumpkin spice.
Pumpkin spice?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Looks like a good one. The case I got was missing 12, but I do need another case. Do we have any mangoes left? 2 cases is fine, Frank. And do you have any volume-filled white peaches, or are they still
Probably
2-layer?
not.
You have a tray pack? I'll take one. What about a volume-filled yellow peach? I'll take one. What stage are the bananas? I can't believe how many bananas I've been going through up there, man. What am I getting for apples? Granny Smiths are still really high.
Yeah, they're in the 60s.
Holy cow.
Red Delicious, I can get you real big.
I don't love Red Delicious. Give me the pink lady. And then do you have an 88 Gala? I'll take one of those. I got the Galeas. The Galeas are beautiful. I'll take it. I'll take an orange flesh honeydew. And what about lopes? How about I can't read my writing. I don't even know where. Oh, do you have any B&W arugula? What about a 4 2.5 spinach? I'll take 2. I'll take a 25-pound bag carrot, jumbo. I'll take a case of tofu.
That's all they want.
That's all they want up there. In sunny downtown Bloomfield. Go ahead, get it.
everything's about labor, but like, that in a sense that piece about what makes us human is our ability to do things, to make things, right? That the real sense of species being and labor. And so when I think about what makes us social creatures, what makes us human, is that we do these things together. And one of the things we do together is we create shelter, and then we create food, we create sustenance. And that need for sustenance drives everything. It drives the economy, it drives social life, it drives cultural objects. Think about the earliest cultural objects people find, right? They're pot shards. Well, what are people putting in pots? They're putting food and water in pots. All of that, to me, is the basis for social and cultural life. We may distance ourselves from it. Part of what we might want to do is free ourselves from that everyday labor, but even in freeing ourselves from it, we're dependent on it. And what creates those dependencies? Does it make it unequal for everybody? Is it communal? Is it shared? In a sense, it gets at all the heart of all the problems that I think are really interesting about people and about our social lives. And again, if you think about culture, which is one of the things I'm very interested in, how we make culture often centers around how we spend time together. And one of the key ways we spend time together is eating. And I think a lot about how much has been written about the complexities of eating alone. And is that good? Is it bad? What does it mean? And part of me believes people never eat alone because their food comes from someplace. That the capacity for someone to eat a meal that they grew and prepared and processed entirely on their own in our world is very slim. So you're always involving some kind of social relations when you're eating, even if you're eating alone.
I conceptualized labor when I first came into the restaurant industry as something that would provide cash very quickly. I think that's why a lot of people make their first foray into restaurant jobs.
The service industry hires more kinds of people than any other industry, right? It's the most accessible. I mean, almost anybody on the street you could stop and they've said they've worked in a restaurant at some point in their lives, you know. I was a hostess when I was in high school or whatever. I mean, even if they don't continue to do that work. And then you have people who are like in love with the work, right? That's what they do. They're like, I am gonna manage a restaurant. I'm gonna own a restaurant. I'm gonna be a head chef. Like some people just love serving or love bartending and that's their thing. They wanna do that for the rest of their lives. They want, and that's great, right? Because it's creative work. You're in front of people all the time. You have a very important job, right?
Because it is seen as this quick turnaround, easy labor. And while I would say that there are parts of it that are easy en route, like if you're waiting tables, it's very clear what it is you have to do. You take people's orders, you clear dishes, you walk, you communicate with the kitchen, you run around a lot. But there's a very interesting mental side to that labor that I don't think is accounted for. And also the physical toll on your body, which I had no idea what that was gonna be like when I started waiting tables and bartending.
Because then you get in the conversation around self-care and what that looks like. You have people who are dealing with racism and sexism and all of these things in their jobs on a daily basis, not just from the people they work with or the practices that they're exposed to every day, but also with their customers. And they're exposed to this constantly. There's not a guidance practice in how to deal with it. A lot of people don't feel backed up. There's not a healthy conversation around how to de-stress, which is why, you know, we see a lot of people going right back out. They get off work at midnight or something, they go right back, you know, they go to a bar down the street, spend a lot of their tip money, and the cycle continues, right?
What's the toll of it on your physical person? What's the toll of it on your mental person? I think those tolls are highly underestimated, and I really think you're earning every dollar that you're making as a server or a bartender or in restaurant management.
Thai gourmet. My mom thought of the name Thai gourmet. I don't think she knows what it really means. But it started around in 2004. My mom was looking to open up a restaurant, and my aunt, she had a food truck at Carnegie Mellon, and she just used this space to dust the prep and open the restaurant while, like, you know, prepping. But it became too much. People were coming in a lot. So she decided it's not for her, so my mom took over. And then that's how it started, with her and her husband, and then with my cousins, and then with me and my sister. My mom would come here early in the morning to prep, I think around like 8 o'clock, 8 in the morning, because she has a food truck at Pitt too. She would prep food for that and then just do her thing, prepare for the whole day. Then I would come in around 10:30 and start prepping.
When you think about labor, you come to kind of two definitions. You come to either the human activity to translate goods or services, or you think about labor as an emotional or physical effort into something. However, when it comes to our industry and what we're doing, like restaurant labor is all of those things. It is physical, it is mental, we are providing a good and a service. Like, it is all of the things that you can consider labor, and it's something that every single moving part, every single person in a restaurant, all of the labor that they do is necessary. There is no like one person or one position that is more important or less important than the one next to it.
I think you get into a really strange situation when you're dealing with the service economy, right? Where your labor does not have a lasting physical presence, but is more about a human connection. And much of what we are trying to deal with in the restaurant industry has to do with not dehumanizing that connection, not treating people like cogs and wheels, not treating people like objects, but like people who are actually engaged in this process by which another person benefits.
I think there are a couple of different skills that you can rely heavily on if you're doing that sort of work. It's beneficial to be someone who uses an organizational tool to keep things straight in your memory. So if you have 5 tables and each of those tables has 4 people at it, and you want to make sure that you're not auctioning off food, you want to remember who ordered everything and kind of what time and space they ordered it in, it can help to think about it as a chess game. That's often how I would think about it. I'm terrible at chess, so I had to adjust that metaphor for myself at some point. But making sure that you're paying attention to every little detail while simultaneously remembering past, present, and future interactions can be really exhausting. It might not be mental labor in the way that we think of it with white-collar work, where it is creative or you need to be coming up with new ideas, but you do need to constantly be shifting your awareness from what did that person just say to now I need to go tell someone this to now I need to start this whole different interaction with a whole new group of people. And make sure that it all happens in a timely fashion, because especially as a server and somewhat less as a bartender, you're the liaison between the front of the house and the back of the house. So you're keeping everybody's timetables correct.
Well, this past few months I have some pretty nasty tendonitis right now in my left elbow because I hand knead all the dough, and we're so much busier than we were last year. We're up like 70% or something. So I really thought my business model was going to have like more bread involved, and it's really not because we're selling so much pizza, and we were selling out so early, like we just have to make sure we have more. So I do have a little bit of arthritis, I think, in my hands, and the tendonitis is really bothering me lately. But that's only kind of come on in the past couple months. I think just this year we're so busy. It's Justin and I. We're going through some real physical growing pains. And our system that we have involves pulling a lot of tables out of the back of a van, like carrying all of our stuff out of our prep space into the van, getting it over to the spot, setting up and breaking down. Like, it's a lot. I mean, you saw the setup. It's not, we do it quickly, but it's a lot of heavy lifting all day long. Like, we're not just making dough in a mixer and hanging out where we are. You know, we get to move it around, and that definitely adds to, I think it's keeping us in shape as well. I don't mind the labor. I enjoy hand mixing dough. Like, I don't dread it. When I mix, I actually don't have a lot of pain because I'm not like clenching my hands or anything like that, but like picking stuff up kind of hurts. Like right now it's tingling a little bit, but it's the way it goes. I think it will go away. I mean, it's just, so try to eat a lot of vegetables so I don't have any inflammation, and hopefully it goes down.
One of the parts of restaurant work that I found very satisfying was the completion of small tasks. It's really satisfying if you're a project-oriented person to finish a bunch of small projects in one day. And then leave the building and be like, I'm done. Very mentally satisfying.
Being able to complete one thing, complete it, and then move on to the next thing is so rewarding. It feels like you're getting somewhere, like you're like checking things off your list instead of like, okay, well, I'm half done with this and now I have to go over there and do this, or because there are so many parts, like, especially with what we're doing, you know, in a juice, there's citrus and there's the stuff with the juicer and, you know, and taking it apart and putting it back together. So to complete one thing, it's like, when it finally gets done, it's like, you know, yeah.
I basically started Driftwood Oven because there was no room for growth in the job that I had. I wanted to work for myself, and I really enjoyed making sourdough bread and pizza. I wrote in my journal one time, kind of late night, and I wrote, "Best pizza in the city, go." And I journal a little bit, so it was kind of like this bold, silly statement, but I wasn't like super happy with like what was happening in the pizza world here in Pittsburgh, just because I knew that most places were sourcing fairly poorly, and it's really important to me to kind of support that local infrastructure, and I really enjoyed baking bread, so I started researching how I could work for myself. And I knew that people would buy pizza because people love pizza, and I love pizza too. I really wanted to do like a bread share to get whole grain breads into people's hands and something that people would like. So we started pizza. We knew that would be like the main part of the income. I did research on ovens so that I could have an oven that wasn't just a pizza oven, meaning that it could retain a lot of heat so that I could bake bread the next day. Originally, I got into sourdough bread because I wanted to make bread and I didn't know where to begin. So I wanted to start at the very beginning, which was 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt, and sourdough culture, which is all it is flour and water anyway. It just plays well with my life, I think. Like, I like the fact that I'm keeping something alive and I'm tending to it, and it has its own life cycle, and right, it's so fascinating how this year-long process can be, you know, so momentary. Making a bread takes maybe 2 days, but harvesting the grain takes a year, and then the seasons come in, and then, you know, you can eat the bread in a second.
Well, as the name suggests, I pursued Yummyholic because I pursue all things yummy. I started baking in high school. I learned how to bake from my best friend at the time. She like came over to sleep over, and I had a cookbook, and she said, oh, why don't we bake? And it was like this big daunting task to me, but she really showed me how fun and easy it was, and we made pineapple coconut squares, and they were like the most delicious thing ever. And since then, like, I kept digging my nose into different baking books, cookbooks, and just kept baking a lot for a hobby. And I think what I love most about it is actually giving it away and you know, sort of multiplying joy in that sort of way. But what I ended up doing is, all right, I have a name, but let me actually test this baking idea. And so I you know, applied for different jobs at a bakery, and that's how I kind of got in, just to get some real life experience in the industry and make sure that my hobby was something more than a hobby, you know, that I could have the grit to pursue. After working a couple years in the bakery, honestly, I loved the work, but I felt like I was getting so underpaid and overworked, so it was really hard for me to survive at the time too, because I was just financially struggling a lot. So I ended up quitting and thinking I'd go back to school, but then it led me to eventually get a cubicle 9-to-5 job, and it was good, steady pay, but I hated my soul felt so crushed. So like all these twists and turns later, I ended up coming back to really full-time pursuing Yummyholic.
Years ago, when I started, there was a man, his name, well, Mr. Angle, I don't remember his first name, but he had a daughter named Claire, and she still does this too. And they had a market in Squirrel Hill. I think it was just called Angle's Market. You know, when I go down at night, I'm sort of like the only female there. There are women who work there, but there's not many that go down and pick up their own produce and do this anymore. I mean, I did it because it was what my father did, and she does it because it was what her father did, and maybe he didn't. I know he didn't have a son, so there you have it. The people that I deal with today knew my father, so for me it was easy, and I mean, my father was just the greatest guy to be able to do this, and I learned so much from him, and they all loved him, and I get the same respect he did, I think. I said a lot of times that I was lucky, but luck doesn't last this long. Now I just say I am blessed, because it's like the best place to be, you know? But it's a good business. It really is. And if you love what you do, it's not like work. Yeah.
I definitely think that the restaurant industry has all of the same problems that any other industry has with dealing with inequality between men and women and cis and trans people. I've personally experienced a lot of sexism at the hands of customers. I think that maybe that's the most obvious place to go when people think about, oh, you're a woman and you're having a negative experience in the restaurant. They think customer harassment. Definitely true. Happens all the time.
So it's difficult because it's two layered, because for the front facing staff, they have to deal with walking the line of handling people who might be treating them in this disrespectful way and how much leeway they have to defend themselves. And as I have been phrasing it with younger coworkers that I talk to, it's maintaining your dignity within this industry because you fear the retribution of being replaceable or feeling that way or not being defended by your boss who might value that customer's dollar over your feelings.
Having a supportive management staff can really alleviate a lot of the problems that you might have with customers. I've worked for a couple of business owners that told me, you know, if you have a problem with a customer and you feel that you're being, you know, talked down to or violated anyway, you have my permission to ask them to leave. And that's extremely empowering. It makes you feel like, okay, well, I have agency in this situation. I don't just have to sit back and take this verbal or even physical harassment. Not every management team is as supportive, and that can cause a lot of issues that we discussed earlier with, am I gonna sacrifice my paycheck in order to stand up for myself in this situation, or say, no, actually, please don't touch me. That's not appropriate, or that comment made me really uncomfortable and now I need to ask you to leave. If you're not getting that support, that's not an environment you should be working in. Not everybody has a choice to leave their workplace. It's something that the restaurant industry has been talking about and needs to continue to talk about until every staff member feels safe interacting with the public.
But as far as the other difficulty is when is kind of behind what the customers don't see, which is it does get very close to the or over the line. Probably most of the time, of things that you would not, language you wouldn't hear, stories you wouldn't hear in other workplaces, just like highly sexualized, joking around. The staff gets, you're with people all day, you get intimate really fast, you're just having casual conversation, you're in a high pressure situation, you go out together after work, you probably drink too much after work. Things get murky. So as far as controlling that, it's also, I think, about letting employees know that, sure, we joke around, but if you feel uncomfortable, it's okay to let someone know, and it won't be tolerated, even if it's another employee that works there.
I don't like that people have said, well, that's just the way it is. If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. You know, you hear that a lot in the restaurant industry. That's what we do. We tease each other. We pick on each other. We do. Is it okay because it's a restaurant? No. Some people can handle it. Some people don't. It doesn't bother them, you know. But I do think that it's a silly way to handle that. Oh, well, that's just the way that it is. It's the restaurant. You know, things are different in the restaurant industry. It's still a place where people are working and people want to feel comfortable. I definitely worked in a restaurant where the guys in the kitchen, there was one gay guy working in the kitchen, and I mean, he got picked on a lot, and he couldn't handle it. It wasn't right, you know, like he definitely got upset a lot. I heard words that you shouldn't hear ever, especially when you're working with someone. You shouldn't be calling people names like that. But again, the kitchen manager was in on it too, you know, was definitely creating that kind of culture. So it really does start at the top. Like, no one's going to say that kind of stuff in this day and age unless they think it's okay. And when you create an environment where you're the boss and you're the one that's starting the teasing like that, then you just open up the doors for all of your other employees to think that that's okay and to make those kinds of excuses. Like, well, that's just the way we talk to each other. We don't have to talk to each other like that. It's I think it's kind of like this insecure thing that people do, is pick on each other to feel better about themselves. And we don't have to do that. Like, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything, you know? There's nothing wrong with working in silence. If you can't say something nice, or, you know, it should always be, you know, positive reinforcement and, you know, trying to create that environment where people are really lifting each other up instead of putting each other down, and it does happen a lot.
As an owner or a manager, there are greater responsibilities that the other staff are going to look to you to fulfill, and I think that we're becoming more and more awake to those realities. The more responsibility you take on in a restaurant in an administrative role, the more service-oriented you have to become, the more supportive of your staff you have to become, if you're looking for something good to happen for anybody. We don't have the luxury of just treating people like objects any longer. I think that we're smarter than that. I think that we know more than that. I think that people are becoming less and less tolerant of that as they're becoming more and more aware of their own value to society. We need our concept of their worth to catch up to the concept of their value, and certainly pay them more. But we also are looking at, more than just basement level policies that have to be put in place about discrimination, for instance, and really looking at what are people going through on a day-to-day basis. And you can't do that unless you listen to them. So, engaging staff in constant dialogue about what their experience is like at work is a long process in and of itself, but something that if you don't do, you can't become aware enough of what shifts you have to make in policy and what shifts you have to make in terms of what you're going to do if somebody is touched inappropriately in the workplace. Certainly, policies of harassment and sexual harassment have been around for a really long time, but in terms of applying those, it becomes kind of a gray area for people. There's just a long-standing culture of guests becoming so empowered as quasi-employers because they're arbitrarily writing the value for their services in a tip line, patting a waiter or a waitress on the hand, or tugging on them or touching them or calling them something that they wouldn't necessarily want to be called. And all of those things have an effect on the person providing that service that is not necessarily good. And I think that those instances I wouldn't be aware of if I weren't talking to my staff about them, or if I weren't asking them what their experiences are like and hearing what they have to say. And when you do that, when you start to engage staff in that way and they become more empowered to handle those situations both on their own and with your backing, you create a different culture internally in the physical space that your guests begin to recognize and appreciate.
There needs to be real consequences. I'm definitely a proponent of having a no tolerance policy. My ideal scenario would be that upon hiring, that a discussion is had with any person you're hiring with, this is the kind of environment we have here. We have a no tolerance policy for sexual harassment or racial comments or comments about class. And if you do any of those things, you'll be fired on the spot. Obviously, there can be he said, she said there, but I think if it's overheard by management or it happens on the floor and it is brought to the attention of management, that it needs to be dealt with immediately. Because often there are people that just bounce around from workplace to workplace. They get fired because they said something or did something or touched someone that they shouldn't have. And people say, oh, that probably just happened once. They're not taking on accountability for hiring those people back. And then, surprise, it happens again. And people are allowed, because of the disconnectedness of the restaurant industry, to continue negative behavior that should have been addressed. It's rough to watch the same problem happen over and over again and watch people be so hurt by it. I don't want to have another conversation with a female coworker who was harassed by someone on the staff or was harassed by a customer and feels like if she brings it up with management that they're not going to take her concerns seriously. That really doesn't help anyone. It's really hurtful to the person it's happening to, it hurts the person who's perpetuating the negative behavior by not being called out about it. We have a lot of opportunities to change the way people think if we're brave enough to, if we're able to address them honestly. We have a lot of opportunities to change people's behavior and outlook. And if you just ignore that, then nothing's going to change. And those same people are just going to be hurt over and over again.
I don't know if I've been through that. Oh wait, yeah, I have. So, I work alone. I work by myself right now. I don't have any employees, and I'm my own boss. But with that, right now, recently, I've been trying to grow into my own brick and mortar space, and that's been such a challenge because no small business workshop I've ever attended prepares me for really all the actual nitty-gritty things that come up. For someone like me who needs to build their own commercial kitchen, I ended up having to learn about 220 voltage and versus 120 amperage and just all these different things that have nothing to do with actual baking, like flour and sugar, but instead I have to learn about electricity and all of this. So what happened is I ended up finding this company that's supposed to be a commercial kitchen consultant. And the rep that I spoke to on the phone was super nice. So I was, excited and going. And it was interesting because that day when I was going to meet these people at the space that I was interested in, I was really nervous. And my boyfriend happened to be with me. And I said, I don't know why I'm so nervous. I feel like I'm pitching, but I'm not. I'm a boss right now and I'm going in. And I guess I'm nervous because I don't want to be seen as this young woman who doesn't know what she's doing, even though that's kind of the truth. Like that is how I was feeling. So the comment he made is, I don't see you as a woman. I see you as an entrepreneur. And I said, I appreciate you looking at me that way, but in the real world, that's not the case. And literally, once we get there and meet this company, everyone in the room are men except for me. And I was basically completely ignored. Even when they walked in the door, it was like they didn't even say hi. I had to go up and say, "Are you so and so?" and kind of let myself be known. But he was incredibly dismissive and ended up calling me princess at least 3 times throughout the entire meeting. And I was so shocked at how I was being treated. I mean, the guy was a complete chauvinist and, don't worry about it, princess. We'll all take care of it for you. And he kept talking to all the men in the room. And I'm the one who's supposed to be hiring these people if I did. And of course I didn't. But that was it was so insulting. But also I was actually so paralyzed in the moment because of shock, I guess, at is this really happening, And even making these offhand comments about, another thing he said was, what am I speaking here, Chinese? And for someone who's Asian American, that's a very insensitive comment. So, those kind of things I ended up facing very head on. And I realized at that moment that was something I would have to get used to, is how I felt. I felt like I had to brace myself for meeting a lot of other jerks along the way of learning these kind of things. So that's a very sort of specific situation that happened to me that made me feel incredibly uncomfortable, made me feel like this is something I'm up against simply because I'm a woman. For someone like an entrepreneur like me, I try to be really aggressive in going out to networking events and things like that. I don't feel that I have to do that as much anymore, but when I did that, I would feel uncomfortable because I really happened to be the only Asian woman in the room. A lot of them were dominated by white men or just everyone else but Asian people, so it kind of made me feel a certain type of way, even if they were trying to be as welcoming as possible.
So we were living in New York. I was working in the fashion industry. I was unsatisfied, to put it mildly, I think, with the type of projects that I was doing. And I was looking for, I think, a new product experience. Yeah, I wanted just to radically change my life and the type of products that I was putting into the world. This was the overcompensation that I decided on.
Yes. It's so funny. I recently went on a family vacation and I basically kept playing with Legos and puzzles and even this crazy adult dot-to-dot book, which has like 1,000 dots on each page. So I think I am a little obsessed with like putting things together. I enjoy it a lot. So.
Jessica Fletcher, she's a murder mystery writer. She took up writing after her husband died.
Okay.
And then she gets quite famous in the murder mystery scene, but she keeps solving murders. So they joke like the Cabot Cove where she lives is like the murder capital of the world because, you know, every episode someone gets killed.
Right.
So, so they allude to that pretty often.
Sexism, racism, and class, right? When you're thinking about those three things, there's always this sort of fight for who's more oppressed, which is ridiculous because obviously it's racism. And the reason being is because of intersectional practices, right? I mean, intersectional feminism, whatever you want to call it, intersectionality is the primary, most important way to think about all of this. Because if you're thinking about things from an intersectional lens, you're able to see how all of these things work against certain people. So if you're going to say, well, sexism is really important conversation to have, well, you can't have that conversation without having the conversation around race because a white woman is still white. So even though she might be up against sexism, she's not dealing with the oppression of racism.
So my mom is white, and I grew up with my white mother in a very white, town in Massachusetts. My sister and I were pretty much the only people in our area that were a little different. So we experienced racism quite a bit growing up throughout our lives. Kind of just got used to it to the point where I almost didn't even realize people were racist, where you're just so used to that behavior that you just thought maybe they thought you were weird or different. But now I'm older and I look back at some things that happened and I'm like, wow, that was blatant racism. For me, I think the experience of not getting the hostessing position that I wanted was only because I got a job at a restaurant in my little white town that was really close to my house. And I don't think that the owners wanted someone that wasn't white at the front door. So even though I applied for a hostessing position, I was given a position in the kitchen as a dishwasher and doing prep work and working a lot harder for a lot less money than the people in the front of the house and longer hours. And, it's a gross job. And I think that even unintentionally, people think that people of color belong doing those dirty jobs. I'm not sure why, but I do think that it's like an unintentional, maybe feeling that people have, well, this person won't be good in the front. We don't want them dealing with our customers, but they'll do a really good job back here doing the dirty job. We obviously live in a really segregated city, so even in the workspace, it's segregated, you have generally, almost all of your front of house employees are going to be white, with the exception of sometimes you do have that busser or food runner that won't get promoted into the serving position but will stay in that position, and that could be a person of color. And a lot of times you walk into kitchens and 90% of the kitchen are people of color. So I'm not really sure when that started or how that started, but it has been a trend. Been doing this for 22 years. And I've always been one of the only people, if not the only person of color in the front of the house. At this point, I'm used to it and I like proving myself and I like blowing people away. So it's not a big deal, but I do still think about it. And I think about what my nephew's gonna have to go through when he wants to get his first job, and I think about, all of those little kids that are eventually gonna need a job that are not white and might have a little bit of trouble getting the position they deserve because of the color of their skin. And it's not fair.
So the reason why a lot of these inequities exist, again, are no different than the reasons why a lot of these inequities exist in every industry. A lot of it has to do with historical inequity, and that has to do with the ability to build wealth or not. And that's directly connected, particularly in Pittsburgh, to redlining practices.
So redlining stratifies American cities into 4 strata. So at the top is the green, which is where white people live in new houses. And a fascinating thing in the redlining process was that they looked for places that had highly restrictive covenants, meaning Jews, foreigners, blacks, Hispanics couldn't move in. They were barred, however that had happened. So then the second is the blue, are areas where it's still white people, but not quite as new housing and not quite as good restrictive covenants. So the infiltration of undesirable racial elements was more possible. Under that, they have the yellow, which doesn't have restrictive covenants, older housing, and more of a mix of population. And at the bottom are what they, where the concentration of these undesirable racial elements. And basically, this gets linked to the banking system, such that as opposed to investing in the places that are most vulnerable, they invest in the places that have the most already. So that and this begins to feed on itself. But if you think about the redlining paradigm, it makes perfect sense. Because if it's red, they have no way to bring anything in because they don't invest in the red. But if they're going to invest, they have to make it green. So that is the choice in the redlining paradigm. You do nothing or you make it green. So they're acting perfectly logically, but the framework is insane. Because why would you set up a society where only white people who live in highly restrictive neighborhoods can have investment? That is how you make a society crazy. So it's a bad paradigm.
But redlining is absolutely the reason, the root in ownership and lack thereof ownership due to redlining practices. And I think that that is something that the owners, particularly white men who own a lot of these restaurants or companies or organizations in these gentrified communities don't know. And I can certainly say factually don't know. I'm in front of these people all the time, and when I talk about redlining, almost nobody knows what it is, no matter what group you're speaking to. It's not something that people talk about or understand, and it is primary, most important, number one thing to understand if you're white, number one, if you want to fight racism, number two, if you want to be a good person in general, you really have to understand that that is your history. It's everybody's history, right? No matter what side you're on of it. And that is exactly why we're in the positions that we're in. Even when you look at other neighborhoods and communities, Lawrenceville is a really great example. It's, you have a lot of white people historically who you would consider poor. These people own their homes. So that's the difference, right? They're selling their homes now. They might have been broke, but they had an asset that's now worth, in some cases, $600,000+ for these little tract homes or whatever. And that's the thing, when you think about, oh, that's just one isolated incident or one home. We're talking about that has happened. Gentrification is not new. Colonization is not new. This stuff has been happening since the beginning of time. So you add up all of those opportunities, and these families have a lot more assets. And I think there was an article recently that came out that said that it would take some 260 some years for people of color to reach that level of wealth. And the reality is that's true. And so I'm not interested in white people talking about diversity and inclusion and racism or any of all of the words unless we're going to have a real conversation about how we're going to get black people to own.
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Okay, cool.
I mean, I was thinking about candy the other day. I grew up around the corner from a corner store, we'd go and get candy for like a penny or 5 cents. And, to me, the beauty of the candy store was just the array. Like, you'd stand there and look at this array of candy and the different ways, those crazy little wax bottles with liquid in them in the shape of soda, right? And taffy and things like that. And to me, the fascination of the fact that we could create things. And my favorite example are things like Peeps, the little Peeps. Like, they used to be a seasonal item, and now they're everywhere and all the time. And when it's everywhere and all the time, of course you don't value it. Of course, it loses meaning. And I think that's true about food. If it's abundant and it's always available, and I mean, when was the last time you go to the grocery store and you need an ingredient and you can't find it, right? Like there's or you can't order it somewhere. Like, it's very, very difficult now to not find what you want. And I think that has a real devaluation in terms of thinking about the work behind creating it. It's hard to value the labor if you don't think that it took much to make that, or if you've always got access to it. Yeah.
When I hear the word labor, it's like the most difficult question to answer, for sure. And I think it's compounded by, especially in Pittsburgh, by its like exponential restaurant growth, it seems like. And but when I think about labor, I think about like all the things this summer I've done to facilitate having lower labor. I mean, there are days when I work garde expo and do dishes. I mean, it's definitely not glorious in a small restaurant like this. I think we've managed, I mean, as a restaurant to run very lean on labor, but also still provide a really quality product. That's the biggest, I guess, like bell curve of the whole thing, is when it meets up with the increased expectations of the average diner too. Doing more with less and just really trying to make it all work. You know, making your fixed cost work and controlling food cost is always a little bit easier, but then also controlling, you know, your own personal time and like the physicality of like what you can do to save money on labor as a chef and especially as an owner. It's been a really hard question to answer this summer. I'll put it that way for sure. This happens all the time, and I'm sure like the guest doesn't notice this, and I'm sure like every other chef feels this way too. Like you go through these moments where you're like really, really, really excited about something. Like I think like the monkfish with like the dragon beans and the like poached tomatoes and the like Tabasco bubbles and the broth and all that stuff. And you're really, really excited about it. You're like, okay, this is like a very nice, simple expression of like how we want to cook here. And then eventually you just get like really, really tired of seeing it, and you're like convincing yourself that it's like utter garbage. So that's kind of like the phase that we've been going through lately. And I think that with the team that we have in place, we've been able to like really quickly and really thoughtfully like change the menu. So like the process today was like, we've been talking about putting octopus back on the menu for a really, really long time. We kind of originally started talking about like, you know, like olive relish or like picadillo and stuff like that with like raisins and pine nuts and stuff like that. And the conversation started from there, and then it was eventually like, well, what if we do like, you know, like a riff on white gazpacho? And then it's like, because it's stationed, we have to like caramelize some miso into it and some sofrito and all that, like kind of like umami building things. With the core group of guys that I have now, that like that conversation happens a lot more quickly. Kind of like we're all kind of like speaking the same language and stuff like that. I think it's really, really hard to, on a certain degree, like when I'm doing invoices all day and stuff like that, and I'm like doing dishes and I'm doing Garmo work and I'm prepping stations and working like that, to like be like, okay, well, we need another dish that we've never put on the menu before to be just as good as every other dish, and if not better than what we put on the menu before. And that's kind of where we are with it. So it's always nice that I have like a core group of guys that like share that like drive and that workload, like, and that kind of comes back to labor, that I've been fortunate enough to like be surrounded by people who don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over again. So.
The way I explain it in class is I talk about the household economy as kind of the earlier version of things. So, you know, not everything was produced in the household, but most things were. And in fact, people within the household have divisions of labor that made them necessary and dependent on one another, right? That's not to say goods didn't come in from outside and there wasn't some monetary exchange, but most of the work that made a household work came from people who lived in there. And those households weren't necessarily just blood relations, right? They often included indentured servants and in the case of the plantation economy, slaves, right? So with industrialization, most of the work and the jobs that men did within that interdependent economy moved out into factory labor and became sort of work for a wage. What that meant in the household economy then is that men were working and getting basically compensation for just their work, like just their labor, not the larger product, but just their actual labor becomes the commodity to be exchanged. In the household, what that meant is that women's labor stayed the same, but it was unpaid. And so there is technological change that makes women's work lives in the household better, but it doesn't reduce the amount of work they have to do. So a great example of that is the washing machine. The electric washing machine reduces women's labor enormously. But what happens is the expectations and the standards for cleanliness, for clothing, for variety increase dramatically. And so where people used to wear the same 2 or 3 pieces of clothing all week and not wash them that frequently, suddenly you have this demand and desire for new clothes. Some of this is all compounded by the fact that the earliest factory laborers in the US were young women. Farm families, household economy would have many children because you have more children you have, the more laborers you have, but women don't inherit. And so if you have a lot of daughters, you know, you basically have more people who maybe be working, but may also be just more mouths to feed in the household. And so those were often the women who were sent off to the early textile mills. And the expectation was that they would be sending money home, or that they would then get married and not work in the mills. But the reality was that many of them stayed, and it was exploitative labor. And there's this different standard of expectation of wage for men and women in that setup. So number one, women were often put into jobs that looked like an extension of what they did in the home. So textiles, shoes, like that kind of small, what they would call, you know, women's nimble fingers labor. Anytime you introduce larger machines, men were brought back into the factories, which is interesting because the machine's supposed to make the labor easier, but it's more technical, and so therefore you need someone who can manage it. And what happens with wage labor that I think is really important to think about, and why we have it the way it is now in these kind of unequal forms, is that middle-class men, think about Mary Poppins, right? Mr. Banks works in a bank, and he makes a salary that allows him to have a wife who can be at home, who doesn't work. And that kind of middle-class Victorian ideal becomes something that working laborers in the factories aspire to, right? The idea of a breadwinner wage. It's not just 8 hours for what we will, right? But it's also a wage that supports a household and a family. But what that meant is that the male laborers were positioning themselves up and against women. And so women were paid less. And you see in the court records, you know, people say, you know, women suing for higher wages, and the court saying, well, women, we pay them this much because they eat less and they don't need as much, and they would spend it on cheap amusements, which are immoral and improper. And so the kind of ideologies that supported gender difference also then support differences in how people were compensated in wage. But when they're pushed in these court documents to talk about how do we establish what is the right amount for a wage, like what you pay, it was always fell back on custom, right? So in other words, whatever was the quote unquote custom of the time or the place, and not any kind of intrinsic valuation of the labor. That leads to this kind of unequal setup in terms of how wage work. It also meant that anytime groups of men laborers, you know, get too demanding in the marketplace, you can always bring in women and children as workers. And in particular, then once you divorce capital from location, you can do it on the global marketplace. So you can pick up your factory and move it to a country where women and children will work for much less.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, everything that we're talking about is based on a capitalist system. How deep a dive do you want to go in? Like, if you think that capitalism is problematic, no matter how much we change things, we're still going to have a lot of these same problems because we're not going to be able to eliminate them.
We decide what the value of something is, what the worth of something is, rather, based upon other people's opinions. We have a fiat monetary system and all of the things that we can talk about that have been documented, but we exist where we exist now. And that system, I don't think, is necessarily going to be changing anytime soon, until such time that we are able to not put individual humans on that same scale.
So I think if you're not trying to dismantle the capitalist system entirely, you just, how can I get the closest to being equitable as I can while still feeding myself at the end of the day?
But I think the deeper problem is how we perceive one another, and whether and how we are able to look each other in the eye and treat each other with respect, and to listen to what each other have to say about different circumstances that we find ourselves in, and whether and how and to what extent we are willing to put ourselves out there to help each other out, and to what extent we're willing to give up some material comfort in so doing.
How can I subvert these small things that I don't like, and how can I take that on as a personal responsibility while still living your own life? I mean, everybody just wants to live a nice life.
Capitalism, socialism, whatever, again, edifice we build is going to fail if we don't look at each other in that very specific way.
And we have to remember to give ourselves a break sometimes. Can't change everything by yourself, which is why we need everybody in on this.
There's this fight for fame, I think, in the restaurant industry. And it's not everybody, because there's plenty of restaurants that are like super chill and like you never hear of, and they're lovely. And, but I think like chef culture is a very fascinating thing. It's a very ego-driven culture, and I think it's debilitating to their own depression and their work lives. There's a lot of that going on in kitchens.
I said, on social media and like very publicly to anybody who's like, listen, but like Sean Brock getting sober is the most important thing to happen in the food service business since El Bulli in the late 90s, like 100%. And anybody's like candidness to talk about burnout, self-care, depression, anxiety, substance abuse. And I think the more freely that we can talk about those things, I think the more robust of a food business we can have, especially in a town like Pittsburgh. There's a reason why people drink every day in the restaurant business. I mean, it's not necessarily physical all the time. It's like, the stress is really, really high. I mean, the stress of operating a business is really, really high. And I mean, it's an easy escape. I know plenty of people who don't drink to get drunk, but just drink enough to get to that point to where they're just not feeling their knees ache anymore, or they're not worried about how many people are going to walk through the door the next day. I've seen a lot of things change in the last, I would say since I was 18, since I was an adult in the restaurant business. A lot of cooks have had a lot of experiences with drugs and alcohol that have very much been leveraged in a romantic way. You know, it's like, let's just get real fucked up. Let's fucking crash. Let's sleep until right before work. Let's be fucking hungover. Let's see how much we can work. Let's see how much we can push ourselves. And it was almost like this romance around it. Like this big macho thing about like, I can do more to myself than you can and still put out a better product than you. And I think that was a very like macho thing. And I think people, especially, you know, my age, have like started to see the change in a very positive way of what that is and everything like that, and to turn away from it, which is really, really good and really, really fantastic. Because I mean, not only alcoholism, but people who are workaholics too. And I mean, I will contest to this, and I tell a lot of people this, that when I was 17 or 18 years old and my mother died, and I grew up with just my mother, my escape was working 60 hours a week. It wasn't a drug, it wasn't booze, it was literally just going to fucking work and not having to think about anything outside of my normal amount of life. And I think that's just as dangerous as, you know, the pill popping opioid crisis and the dope, you know, and the alcoholism. I mean, I relish the day when it's just like everybody just gets stoned on recreational marijuana all day, and like I don't have to deal with a bunch of peers that have drinking problems, because that's just like, there's no social stigma attached to alcoholism, really. I mean, I can walk in any bar down the street here in Bloomfield and just get bombed, and nobody's going to think twice about it, you know? So I think we're starting to see a lot of that catch up as an industry and as a culture. But self-care is really important. Like, I personally have been like, you know, I don't even drink recreationally anymore. And I've really, really tried just to give myself some space, especially in the mornings, like with my, you know, at my home, with my dog, with my wife and stuff like that. And, you know, just before anything happens, you know what I mean? Just like to slow down.
I've seen ESPN's new.
Well, bike lanes aren't a complete waste, you know, like they feel like a slow.
Reach out to you. I mean, I know you have success, so how are you going to do that? I don't know how serious
Keep coming. Getting it down. Yeah.
It's good, but I can give you some.
Argot. In the sweaty restaurant kitchen, where I'll learn to cuss in Mexican, tattooed line cooks talk shit in voices nicked as the bone-white monkey bowls we stack and fill. They call the boss and picky customers chupacabra, goat sucker being the inside joke for every pain in the ass. Years ago, in a place once a mustard factory, I was a boy touring mom's latest food prep gig. A windowless world where the clam chowder paddled around in vats deep enough for me to stand. And I wore a paper hat, same as the mustached men in bloody aprons, who cut up and kidded while they hacksawed T-bones from beef sides. Now, I dig 12-hour grooves of full trays and spaghetti joints with family names. I keep ice bins full and counters clean, wondering at times if the routine has replaced the oxygen of my dreams with a working life that takes what it wants, stealing my pen and handing me bad math on credit slips. On her days off, Mom wants to play Scrabble, but instead we talk about our fingers, how they've split into open-flowered nerves, stinging our bodies to the bulk of a weary self at the end of the day. Each of us searching for the phrase that captures what it is to feel at once both capable and small.
Awesome.
Okay. Good stuff, man.
Yeah, it's great.
All right.